Tēnā koutou katoa ki tēnei ruma. Anei au e mihi ana ki a koutou I tēnei rā. And I'm scrolling through and seeing some faces that I know. So ngā mihi nui to a few familiar faces in the room. It's lovely to have you all here today at the end of a long day, I'm sure. So I really appreciate you. Yes, I can see you too, Gretchen. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've got an hour together, which was not nearly long enough, and I will keep you here till 8 o'clock tonight if you give me the chance to. So we're not going to let Janelle just talk all night, but I am I'm really wanting to share some goodness with you today and start some great conversation. So I am going to try and get as much goodness into an hour as we possibly can. So I'm going to jump into screen share mode, but I wanted to just mihi to you all while I can see your faces before I jump into screen share and start us off with a karakia. Okay, I can see you on my screen, Stephen. So if I need to stop, give me a wave, e hoa, at any time. Or a shh, that's enough. Ka whai. Oh, well, mākui karakia mā tātou I tēnei rā. Me e noi tātou. Unuhia te pōwhiri marama, tomo kia te ao whatu tangata, tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahorau, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou. O, ko waiau, e noho ana I te wāhi rorohiko, ko Janelle Riki-Waaka tēnei, he uri tēnei no tainui waka, no whaingaroa ahau, engari e pākeki ana au I konei ki o tautahi I raro, I te maru o te haukainga I konei ngai tuahuriri, ngai tahu whānui, he mihi ka tika ki a rātou, ko Janelle Riki-Waaka, tōku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, really lovely to be with you here for the next hour, and this is kind of a little bit of me on a page. I whakapapa back to Tainui Iwi in the Waikato on my Karawa side, and on my Kuia side we have a hono to Ngāti Hauiti ki Rata, up around the banks of the Rangatiratanga there, and I live in Christchurch. Mama bear of 5 beautiful kids and eldest child of 4, and I've just popped a photo of our old man Tama. That's Tama in the Father Christmas suit, because he's in driving us all crazy, but he's probably in his final days, and so I'm taking him on a tour with me. I'm putting him in all my slides for a little while. He's coming around the country with me because I'm about to get on the road for the next couple of weeks. So that's our old man Tama. And so if you hear the noise in the background, I'll apologise, but as it turns out, when you have karawa status as a dog, you get to bark and do anything you like, anytime you like. And he didn't listen to me when I told him he needed to be quiet for an hour. So we'll see how we go. But I'm sure you'll understand, such is life post-COVID. We sometimes are at home and there's noises and things. So thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I just want to share you, I'm a total fangirl of Maya Angelou, and if you haven't discovered anything that Maya's done, I really encourage you to have a look. She's got some great podcasts. She's an amazing writer, an amazing poet, and this is a whakatauki, if you like, that I live by, and it is do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. And I live by this. I say it on repeat to my kids probably 100 times a week, I'm sure. And what I love about it is because critical reflection, as we know, particularly as leaders, is such an important part of growing as a person, as a leader, as a practitioner. And but what's really important to remember as we are critically reflecting on our own practice is that we do the best we can in that moment with what we have, with the resources, the knowledge, the time, the maturity, all of those things that we have at hand. That is what we have able to access when we make a decision or when we do something. And it's very easy to reflect on something and beat yourself up about it and think, gosh, that was a bit rubbish, or I could have done a bit better there, or I can't believe I did that. But we've got to remember that in that moment when we made that decision, when we did that, it was the best we could do then. When we do know better, however, that comes with a responsibility to do better. So when we've grown, when we've learned a little, when we have flexed our expertise, then there comes a responsibility with that to do better. When we know better and we don't do better, that's when we're in the realm of ignorance, I think. So the tono here, the wero for us all today is perhaps, if this is new learning for you, then I'm hoping by the end of this session, there might be some things that you know better, and it will come with the responsibility of now, what will I do better? Now that I've had the kohara of that knowledge, what do I need to do better? So I'm a big believer in starting off with the why, because if we don't get the why right, then it's really hard to focus in on the how. So why should we be te reti honouring? Why form equitable partnerships? Why is te reti or waitangi even important? So let's have it explore some of those. Now I'm going to do this fairly quickly. I just want a disclaimer. When I do my treaty work, I do it at a minimum over a full day, and we've got an hour. So I'm going to brush over the articles of te reti without delving in too deeply. But I do want to share this graphic with you. It's from the Treaty Resource Centre. It's a really great one for explaining, particularly for those of us that work in education, what the ethical and legal obligation is to honour te reti. So Te Tiriti was signed between the British Crown and Hapu later became iwi and Maori. And it's important for us to know and understand that the concept of iwi and Maori are post-colonisation concepts. We lived as Hapu traditionally and historically, and Hapu were like mini little sovereign nations. They had their own law, L-A-W, own tikanga or law, L-O-R-E. They were governed, self-governing. They often had their own language, their own dialects, their own kawa and tikanga, and so they were quite different from each other. We didn't have the collective name of iwi or even wider collective name of Maori, because Hapu were considered, in a sense, as different as, say, Tonga and Samoa. So the British Crown signed te tiriti with Hapu, and which later became iwi and Maori. And it's really important that we acknowledge that there was also at that time a whole bunch of Hapu who decided not to sign te tiriti. They came to the hui or took the new car for a test drive and decided not for them, and said no thank you very much. But there were also a whole bunch of Hapu never involved. They didn't get the pānui, they weren't at the hui, and they weren't aware what was happening at that time. And many of those Hapu were, I guess, isolated in a sense geographically, top far north, very bottom of the south, or in some places that they actually didn't take te tiriti. Later, in about 1852, the New Zealand government was formed after the signing of te tiriti, from which government departments, parliament, courts, etc., were born. And of course, one of those government departments is the Ministry of Education, where largely schools, kura, SEEs, kahuiako, etc., are funded. So we are, and I'm sure this isn't a surprise to you, agents of the Crown or Crown employees. So that said, everybody on that sort of left-hand side, born of the Crown, if you like, is legally obliged to uphold the assertions of the British Crown to Maori. And that's how the legal obligation and ethical obligation looks. And believe it or not, I still meet thousands of teachers who don't quite get how we're legally obliged to uphold te tiriti. So it is really important that we get this graphic out and we have a look at it and we chat about it. So everybody that lives on the Crown side, or has been born of the Crown, if you like, is legally obliged to uphold the assertions in te tiriti as made by the Crown to Maori. And that sort of explains the ethical obligation. Of course, how does the Ministry of Education make sure we do that? They do that through the code and standards. That's how they ensure their employees, if you like, are meeting the obligations as stated in te tiriti. Have a quick read of that. I'll stop my mouth for a wee second so you don't have background noise. I think what strikes me in this quote is the fact that lots of things strike me in this quote, but one of the things that jumps out is the fact that it was written in 1976. And so I am reminded that we've been having this conversation for a really, really long time. And to be honest, I don't know that we've made enough of an impact. I believe we've definitely improved in practice. I think we've been working tirelessly, and so that's not what I'm questioning, but I do not think we've made enough of an impact yet. So we have to ask ourselves, and the profession, I guess, what will it take to make a big enough impact so that I'm out of work, essentially, and that there is a significant, meaningful change to our schools and to the confidence and capabilities that our schools have to support culturally diverse kids. So we've still got a way to go. I want to celebrate how far we've come and recognise that we still have a wee way to go as well. Essentially, if you were a child like me, Maori, and you went to school in the, let's just say it was the end of the 70s, when I started, well, actually early 80s, let's be honest, early 80s, then you were confronted with predominantly white faces, white walls, white faces everywhere, all teachers, all staff. I didn't have one Maori teacher at my school until probably fifth form in high school. So I hadn't encountered one brown face anywhere in the teaching profession as a child until I was well into my teens. And the content is all white. So everything around you is white. I was reading books about, mother takes Timmy to the beach, and I couldn't even figure out who uses the word mother. I was like, who calls their mum mother? That there was, everything was white. And if you are confronted with that as a child in the education system, then you start to think that the dominance of it must mean it's right, or at least more right than you are, that there is a right way and a wrong way. And kids will make their own minds up about that just based on the environment we place them in, whether we want them to think that or not. It is very it is a very real outcome for many of our kids, that whiteness becomes rightness. So how do we decolonize education and decolonize our education, the settings that our tamariki are going into? And so that it isn't a thought that white is right. And what is it that we need to know better? As I said, we're going to go through this fairly quickly, but I also want to make sure that I have space. So please use the chat, and anything we don't get to today, I can come back and answer any questions after the fact. There are two texts, many of us know this, Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the Treaty of Waitangi. Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the Maori version, and the Treaty of Waitangi is the English version. Around 540 rangatira signed Te Tiriti, and only about 39 rangatira signed the treaty. What not everybody knows is that the only true and legal version in the eyes of the law is Te Tiriti o Waitangi. That is because international law states that the only legal version of a treaty is the one that is written in the language of those that sign it, which makes sense, right? The people that signed it need to understand what they signed. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the legal version. It's the one that we hear grievances against in court in the Waitangi Tribunal. It also, I would argue that the 39 chiefs that signed the Treaty of Waitangi, of those 39, we'd have to question how many understood what they were signing, being that it was written in English. Many Māori had English by that stage, of course. Not all Māori could read in English, and certainly not words like sovereignty and Her Majesty and things like that. So I'm not sure how many of those 39 rangatira would have understood what they were signing in the English version. What is interesting is that not everybody knows and understands that, and I still hear this all the time, one is a translation of the other. It is not. They are completely two different documents that say two different things. And that's really important to understand. What is interesting is I heard someone say to me the other day, why are we still teaching about the Treaty of Waitangi then? It's not actually a thing Te tiriti is the legal version. It is the one that the rangatira signed. That's what we should be teaching in schools. And I tend to agree with that. It's important to know about the treaty, but te tiriti is what we need our tamariki to understand. So what does te tiriti say? So Article 1, Kāwanatanga, is honourable governance. And interestingly, I think when you put the word honourable in front of the word governance, it actually has another connotation, doesn't it? It's not just governance, it's honourable governance. And honourable governance, if we were to govern in an honourable way, we would be making decisions alongside those that are going to be impacted by those decisions the most. I think that's how we govern in an honourable way. What did it actually say? Well, in 1835, the Declaration of Independence was signed between the Crown and rangatira Māori, which gave sovereignty of Aotearoa to rangatira and their hapu, so to the chiefs and their hapu. In essence, Māori had absolute sovereignty over Aotearoa New Zealand for 5 glorious years from the Declaration of Independence. And then in 1840, Article 1 stated that the British Crown would like to establish a government for existing and new British settlers. And in doing so, that they were not to create laws that would give rights over and above tangata whenua, or the Māori people that lived there. So if you were giving mana to Article 1 in an education setting, you would be affirming Māori as tangata whenua. And I would suggest affirming is a bit of a step up from acknowledging. So we'll have to give some thought about how we might affirm Māori as tangata whenua in our learning communities. We would have effective and equitable relationships with Māori, a shared decision-making process with whānau hapu iwi, and a common saying from one of our local hapu down here, nothing about us without us. And I love that one. It's making sure that all the right people are seated at the table. So if it affects us, we want to be part of the decision. Māori tikanga and kawa appropriate to local context is recognised and affirmed. Appropriate to local context means the tikanga and the kawa of your local iwi or hapu, where your school is situated, where it lives. So that's the tikanga and kawa that schools should adopt, and you'll need to work alongside your local iwi and hapu to understand that best. Really important question I like to plant in people's brains when you're making decisions, when you're planning for the future and you're sitting in that hui, simply asking, wait a minute, whose voice is missing from this conversation? Who's not at the table that needs to be at the table? And that's a really good one to just plant in your brain. Wait a minute, who's missing from this conversation? And if need be, we put the conversation on hold until all voices are present. Dr. Moana Jackson, I'm a massive fan of Dr. Moana Jackson, and I went and heard him speak recently, and he shared that they are starting to use the term partnership less and less in the tiriti legal space now. And the reason why, he said, is because you can have inequitable partnerships. So we've got to be really careful about just using the word partnership. So instead, in the legal space, they are using words like co-governance, co-led initiatives. I would say partnership is still great to use. I still use it, but I don't use it by itself. I use it with equitable. So equitable partnerships, not just partnerships on their own. Okay, so I'm going to throw out a question for you all now. If we were to govern in honourable ways and establish authentic, equitable partnerships, what might we need to check at the door? So it's a bit of a provocative question. So if we're going to govern in an honourable way and establish really authentic, equitable partnerships, what are we going to need to check at the door? Okay. Article 2, rangatiratanga, or Maori Self-Determination Authority Agency. What did Article 2 say? It stated that the Crown recognised and upheld tino rangatiratanga and taonga. So tino rangatiratanga being the paramount authority of hapu to have sovereignty, to have care, to have kaitiakitanga over all that is precious to them. Tino rangatiratanga is the ability to determine one's own future, to make decisions for oneself, to be self-governing, and to determine their own future, the way they wanted to live, and the future of their people. So that's what tino rangatiratanga is. And taonga are tangible and intangible things. So they can be things you can touch, property, possessions, those kinds of things, but also anything living that has inherent value to Māori. So te reo Māori is a taonga, culture, hauora or health, those kinds of things. There was another clause in Article 2, rangatiratanga, that talked about hapu and crown transactions over land. There was even a desire for those rangatira that signed it to formalise a process of land selling, because there was a lot of backdoor deals going on and a lot of land being lost over confusion, language differences, all kinds of things. So there was a desire for both the Crown and Māori to allow land transactions to happen. So if we were giving mana to Article 2 of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in our schools, then Māori would be achieving success as Māori, and I'll unpack that a wee bit more soon. Māori having agency, choice, the power to act, the power to determine, and so that would be Māori whānau sharing their aspirations for their tamariki with their schools and their kura, and then walking alongside them to bring those aspirations to life. Māori diversity is recognised and valued, and self-determination enacted. And by Māori diversity, I mean, we wouldn't assume that by having the 4 or 5 Māori whānau at the whānau hui, and their opinion was that opinion would be shared by any and all Māori in the wider community. We know and understand Māori are just as diverse as non-Māori are, and so understanding the differences between hapu and communities, between haukainga and those mana whenua groups, as well as Māori who live in communities other than their home communities, and understanding their place as well in our whānau. What we know historically is that our education system wasn't designed for Indigenous kids to be successful. It was absolutely, deliberately, systematically designed to assimilate them. In fact, we wrote it into law. The primary purpose of education for Native students is to assimilate them into dominant culture. We wrote it into law. We wrote it into the Education Act. And that's what Colonisation 101 is. Actually, education becomes the most expedient weapon by which to colonise a people. This photo I find quite funny and hilarious for a number of different reasons. It might be a bit tricky to see on your screen, but if you Google it, you can actually see probably a clearer copy. For a couple of reasons. The map just shows Europe, and apparently the rest of the world isn't so important in this class. Secondly, you can see this is an infant class, so the kids are various ages, but it seems to be the first year of school. And all of these beautiful Māori kids, and they're not all Māori in the room, but there are a lot of Māori kids in the room, are drawing fish and what I think is the snail or a slug as well. And they are all exactly the same. So there's either been some very clear instructions, draw your fish like this, or they're copying one off the board or something like that. But what I find really ironic is there's a very good chance that some, if not many, of these kids have probably caught anywhere between 20 and 100 fish in their lifetime, but they needed to come to school to learn about fish. And to learn about fish, you draw one on a board. And to learn about fish, you draw one exactly the same as the person next to you and everybody else in the room. And I don't know about you, but that's not actually how fish look. Like the drawings, these kids would have caught fish and held them in their hands and actually, have a ton of knowledge that they could bring to this kaupapa. But as you can see, that knowledge is not welcome. This is how you draw a fish. So it was a place to colonise Māori kids. And I would argue the remnants of some of that thinking is still very much alive and well in our education system. And so what are we all going to do about that? And how do we decolonise our education system, decolonise our schools, and decolonise our classrooms and the content that our kids are learning? Māori achieving success as Māori, and I have had the absolute privilege of working in many schools over many, many years in Aotearoa. And I can tell you that often schools collect Māori success data. And what I would say about that Māori success data is that actually, in fact, that is the success of Māori as opposed to as Māori. So non-Māori measures producing just academic data that just shows their academic achievement in non-Māori subjects. That is just how well have Māori kids been successful in predominantly academic subjects that are not kaupapa Māori. So I don't believe that is Māori success data. It's certainly not with my parent hat on. If you were to ask me with my mama bear hat on, what is success as Māori for you, Janelle? I would say my kids having opportunities to grow in their Māoritanga, to learn in, through, and about their language, culture, and identity. I would say it is the opposite. If education was the weapon by which we assimilated Māori kids, then please let it be the vehicle by which we give them back their language, culture, and identity. Please let it be that, because I love education and I love being a teacher. So success as Māori is Māori kids being able to learn who they are, learn their language, learn their tikanga, learn their kawa, learn about their ancestors, and grow in their Māoritanga. That is success as Māori. It is very different than what some schools are choosing to gather as success data. So I would ask you to go away and have a think about how you might actually collect and celebrate the success of your Māori students. Okay, this time we won't go into breakout rooms, but I do have another provocative question, and I'll stop sharing in a wee second. What are the barriers to Māori having rangatiratanga or self-determination in my school or workplace? So if rangatiratanga is the ability for Māori to be self-determining, the ability for them to be by Māori, for Māori, to have their seat at the table, to have not just the seat at the table, have their voice heard and acted on, what are the barriers in our current schools or in your workplace that prevent Māori from having absolute tino rangatiratanga? NCA credits assessment. You know what? I don't think assessment's going away anytime soon. It seems to be a concrete post that's reinforced with steel in a sense. The idea that kids come to school, they need to be assessed based on what they've learned in order to acquire some kind of recognition, and that tohu or that representation of what they've learned is going to open golden gates and get them a job. I don't know that that's going away, but I do think there are some things in and around that we can shift. I think the world is changing, and it is changing rapidly. NCA was meant to be designed to be flexible enough that kids could find their own pathways through there. I can see that people are playing around with the flexibility of it now, which is exciting. As a mum, I had enough knowledge about NCA to map my son's sort of journey through it. He never sat exams. He didn't want to. I didn't want him to. The good thing about NCA, you don't have to. we were like, assignments are our best shot here. Internal assessments are our best shot here, because he was no good in a 3-hour situation under pressure in that sense to have knowledge in his head. So it was meant to be designed to be flexible, and I don't know how successful we've been, but what I would say is I'm enjoying hearing amazing stories of schools who are pushing the boundaries of NCA. So there are some possibilities in that space. And I think we just need to share more often about what we're doing. There's lots of things possible. Yep. I was one of those mums that was pretty, like if we can get to from credit number 79 to 80, we're going to have a party. That's all we're doing. And it wasn't that it was a minimum. It was that it was a stretch to get him out of bed and get him to school every day. So, we were real about what we wanted to achieve and why. And I do think that more parents would come on board and walk alongside schools more, but the vast majority of parents are really uneducated about NCA, to be honest. They just don't get it and don't understand it. It's technical. So we might need to do some work with our whānau because we want to be more involved. Many of us do anyway. Okay, I'm going to carry on. I'm aware of the time. I know how amazingly hard you've all worked today, and I do not want to keep you any longer past 5 o'clock. So I will keep going because I just want to finish off the last bit. But there's brilliant kōrero, and I have changed the permissions now on the Jamboard. So please do go back and add your thoughts in because I think it would be really powerful to carry on the conversation in that space. All righty. So we've looked at Article 1, Article 2. And Article 3, Oritetanga or equity. What did Article 3 say? Maori have the same rights as British people. It didn't say it like that. I've simplified it. It said something like, the native people of Aotearoa will have all rights bestowed upon them as do the British citizens and rights and protections of the British Crown. Something nice like that. But essentially, Article 3 said Māori will have the same rights as British people, as well as having these wonderful newly found rights that the British sovereignty gave to us. We could also maintain our own rights. And by rights, they meant citizenship, rights, entitlements, and responsibilities with regards to both contexts, both Māori and non-Māori context. If you were giving mana to Article 3 in your education, in your learning community, in the interests of all, Māori have the same rights and opportunities as non-Māori. And I love that in the interest of all. In the interest of all, Māori are thriving in Aotearoa. I believe it is in all of our best interests that the Indigenous culture of Aotearoa are thriving. And I would say for a long time we've been surviving. So I'm looking forward to the transition from survival to thriving. And I believe we're on the precipice of that, and it's an exciting time for our people here in Aotearoa. Educational barriers and inequalities are removed and equitable education outcomes are achieved. And that's the aspiration, that's the dream, that's the big goal. Truth be told, most people in education know what the barriers are. If we have a really deep and honest conversation, most leaders and teachers will say, yeah, I do know what the barriers are that will prevent Māori and our Pacific nations, our tamariki from our Pacific nations, achieving equitable outcomes. We know what those barriers are. Some of them feel like concrete posts that we can't kick over, but there are others we can. And I implore us all really to look at what differences we can make, because if we know the barriers exist, we've then got a responsibility to do something about them. I think as a profession, collectively, how do we do that? And I think we have to hold each other's hands in those spaces. Education content and delivery reflects Aotearoa and our dual heritage, past, present and future. This one is the one that I talked about at the beginning of the session. If you are a Māori kid and the walls are white and the books are white and the faces are white and everything's white, what about if we started to work towards an equitable representation of the dual heritage of Aotearoa? And that means we would see and hear and feel the Indigenous culture of Aotearoa. And we would do that in schools, the places where we educate people. Te reo tikanga and mātauranga Māori is valued and prioritised in education. Again, we're on a journey for that as well. A question I often ask people is, walk around your school and put me on your shoulder. Put me on your shoulder or channel Janelle, the mother of Māori tamariki. She's come to our school and she is making a decision. Is this the place where I want to leave the people that I love most in this whole world, my most tino taonga? I want to leave them in the care of this school. What would I hear and see and feel when I come to your school, when I read your website, when I jump on your Facebook page, when I have a look at your school blogs, when I stand in your office? That's going to send me a message. Yes, Janelle, drop your kids off here, we will look after them. We will value and celebrate the uniqueness of your tamariki, their wonderful culture, Maori. What would I see, hear, and feel? Furthermore, if I was standing in your hall or your staff room or anywhere, playground, library, how would I know this is a school in Aotearoa? Or could I be anywhere in the world? Could I be in France or Germany or Finland? How would I know when I ring your school that this is a school in Aotearoa? How would I know when I go on your website, this is a school in Aotearoa, New Zealand? And should I know? Should I know in a school the places in our society where we educate people? Should I know that there is a dual culture and heritage in Aotearoa? Ultimately, teachers will say, well, we're a multicultural society now, and we are. We absolutely are. Our communities are becoming more and more diverse. So how do we do this for every child? Should every child feel a sense of belonging to their school? Janelle's opinion, 100%. Absolutely, every child should feel like they are coming home to school every day. Every child should feel a sense of belonging to their kura. And we are a multicultural society, and I believe we're better off for it. I believe it makes us a better society. I think Aotearoa and its diverse nature makes us one of the most special countries in the world. But here's what I will say about the many people who choose to migrate to Aotearoa. For most of them, their language, their culture, and their identity is being cared for in their countries. If they've chosen here to migrate here to Aotearoa, their language, their culture, their identity and history lives on in their homes. They have it to go home to if they would like to. It doesn't mean to say they can't have it here and shouldn't have it here. I absolutely believe that they should and they can have it here, but not at the expense of the Indigenous culture. The Indigenous culture of this country needs to come first because this is the only place in the world where you can find it. It is our job. It is everybody's job in Aotearoa to care for, to nurture, and to make sure that the language, culture, and identity of Maori is here for many generations to come. And those that choose to migrate here can have their culture, and they can also roll up their sleeves and help us revitalise and protect te ao Māori here. And many of them want to. Why? Particularly because they've come from a country where they know and understand the value of protecting and revitalising their cultural practices. Many of them want to help us and get in the waka and be an ally for revitalising and protecting te ao Māori. So yes, can I say when it comes to te tiriti, there are only two treaty partners, Māori, tangata whenua, and non-Māori, tangata tiriti. And under non-Māori are sixth generation New Zealand born Samoan, or I just arrived from Malaysia last week and I'm going to live here for the rest of my life. It doesn't matter. New Zealand born Pākehā, they are all non-Māori. The treaty partners, the two treaty partners are tangata whenua and tangata tiriti, or Māori and non-Māori. That's in the treaty circle. And we're not discounting anyone's culture, and we're not discounting I was born here, I am a Kiwi. It is talking about te tiriti and the two treaty partners. Article 4 is the spoken promise. The rangatira that met in Waitangi to sign te tiriti had raised concerns about the missionaries that were there at the time in converting Māori to Christianity. That wasn't the issue at all. The issue was discrediting the spiritual beliefs of Māori, reducing them to myths and legends, reducing their importance. Phallic symbols on carvings were being burned. in fact, whole marae were being burned. The pagan belief system of, Maori who believed in gods was being discredited and belittled, and the rangatira were very concerned about that. They were happy for Maori to convert to Christianity if that's what they wanted to do, and that's fine, but they believed that the spiritual beliefs and practices of both Western and Maori shall be protected. In other words, people could choose which belief system. I would argue, in fact, that spirituality or atuatanga, Māori's belief in atua that connected to the environment, could happily coexist with a faith, a Christianity or a faith-based belief. And I believe that Māori could have had both, but there was certainly a pressure to leave one behind and convert to another. So Article 4 is about actively promoting and protecting and revitalising te reo, tikanga, history, mātauranga Māori, pūrākau. I'd love to see us call the stories of Maui and the stories of tāwhaki pūrākau rather than myths and legends. Pūrākau are stories. Myths and legends belittles them in a sense. And there are some pretty big, far out, unbelievable stories in the Bible as well. We don't need to question those. We don't have to belittle them. And I don't believe we have to reduce the stories of my ancestors by calling them myths and legends. I'd much rather us use words like pūrākau or paki waitara, stories of our ancestors. Okay. We're gonna finish on this last question, and I'm just looking at the time. Thank you so much. If anyone's had to disappear, I completely understand, but thank you to those that have hung in there for another couple of minutes. I just want to finish talking about what are some of the practical actions we can take on to decolonize our education for our tamariki Māori. How might we decolonize our classrooms, our education system, so that we can get more equitable outcomes for our Māori kids? So we'll finish on that question, but I do want to just share with you, and you'll get the slides, that I've put a couple of great resources in here for you to have a look at as well. I will finish with our karakia, so that those of you who want to say around and wānanga about our last questions, practical suggestions, can do that, but those that need to go can also head off home for 1 o'clock. So I will say our karakia in case you need to go. And before I do, I want to share a beautiful quote from my auntie Eva Rickard. So I'm from Waikato Tainui, from beautiful Raglan, and Auntie Eva is one of my kuia and one of my favourite sayings, and she was a pretty formidable woman. Me arahi, me whai, me whakawātea rānei. I love this. Lead, follow, or get out the way. I think that's really powerful. I want to thank you for your time today. I will finish us with a karakia in case you do have to go, so you are suitably blessed on your journey back home. But if you can hang around and just wānanga for a few more minutes, I'd love to have a kōrero, and I'm happy to hang around for a kōrero for anyone that can. Ka pai, tēnā koutou e te whānau, māku I karakia mā tātou, unuhia te pō, whirimarama, tomo kia te ao whatu tangata, tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahorau, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e.